My parents disowned me for buying a junk store instead of funding my brother's honeymoon. Mom coldly said, "You're just useless trash," and said I wasn't their son anymore. Now, they're begging me. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. I'd love it if you could share in the comments which city or country you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin our story together. The air in my childhood home always smelled faintly of lemon polish and Mom's expensive perfume, a carefully curated scent designed to mask anything less than perfect. Growing up, Mark was the polished furniture, gleaming under the sunbeam of my parents' approval. I was the rug tucked in the corner, useful for catching dirt but largely unnoticed. He was the star athlete, the effortless academic, the charming one. I was just me, quiet, introspective, finding comfort in the dusty corners of the garage or the worn pages of old books. Dad always patted Mark on the back after a game, a firm, proud sound that resonated through the house. My back just felt empty, like a space waiting for a hand that never landed. Their favoritism wasn't loud or dramatic in the early years. It was subtle, insidious. Mark's needs were urgent. Mine could wait. His problems required immediate financial solutions. Mine required me to figure it out. Mom had a way of framing every request as a matter of family duty, a quiet expectation that I would contribute, support, and enable, especially when it came to Mark. I remember working weekends through college, bussing tables and scrubbing floors, to scrape together enough to help pay for their new roof after a storm. I missed trips with friends, study groups, the fleeting moments of youthful freedom. When I gave Mom the check, she just nodded, tucking it into her purse. "Good boy, David," she said. "That money helps. Never a thank you. Never a recognition of the sacrifice. It was simply expected. A quiet, constant draining away of my resources, both financial and emotional." Mark's wedding to Sarah was, predictably, an extravagant affair. My parents spared no expense, determined to project an image of effortless success and familial bliss to their friends and community. There were floral arrangements that cost more than my monthly rent, a band flown in from out of state, a guest list that seemed to grow daily with people I'd never met but who were apparently vital to the family's image. The stress in the house leading up to it was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mom was a whirlwind of frantic energy, barking orders, obsessing over tiny details. Dad fretted about the mounting bills, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a tight, worried frown. Watching them, something in me, that old, deeply ingrained sense of obligation, kicked in. I had a decent amount saved up, money I'd planned to use as a down payment on a small apartment, or maybe even to fund a modest business idea I'd been kicking around. But seeing their stress, feeling that familiar pull to be the dependable one, I stepped in. Quietly, without fanfare, I offered to cover the catering deposit, a sum that made my bank account scream in protest. Mom's face, etched with worry lines, smoothed instantly. Dad let out a sigh of relief that sounded like deflating tires. "Oh, David, bless your heart," Mom said, a flash of warmth in her eyes that I rarely saw directed at me. It felt, for a fleeting second, like I was finally buying a small piece of belonging, a ticket into the inner circle. The wedding was a blur of forced smiles, awkward small talk, and watching Mark and Sarah bask in the glow of hundreds of admiring eyes. I stood on the periphery, sipping champagne that tasted vaguely of disappointment, feeling like an extra in a movie about someone else's life. Mark, of course, barely acknowledged my contribution. He was too busy enjoying the show, too caught up in being the center of attention. That was Mark, charming, self-absorbed, and utterly reliant on the invisible scaffolding of parental privilege and, apparently, my wallet. A few weeks after the wedding dust settled, I was driving home from my job, a steady but uninspiring gig in data entry, when I saw it. An old, dilapidated building on the edge of town, tucked away on a street corner I rarely used. It had a faded for sale sign stuck crookedly in the overgrown grass out front. It looked like a forgotten relic, paint peeling, windows grimy. On impulse, I pulled over. The sign listed a contact number and a price that made me do a double take, $2,900. It wasn't for the building renovated. It was for the structure as is, the land parcel and whatever dusty, forgotten treasures might be inside. A junk store. Stepping inside a few days later, key heavy and cool in my palm, was like stepping back in time and into a different world entirely. The air was thick with the smell of aged paper, dry rot, and something metallic and rusty. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through a cracked window pane. It was a mess, overwhelming and daunting. But beneath the grime and decay, I saw something else. Potential. A space I could shape, fill with things that had stories, connect with people outside of my usual orbit. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement that was entirely my own, not borrowed or assigned, not tied to anyone else's approval. It was risky, maybe foolish, but it felt like a lifeline. I used the remaining money I had, the chunk I'd intended for a future down payment, and bought the place. I didn't tell my parents right away. It felt too precious, too vulnerable to expose to their immediate judgment. I started spending my evenings and weekends there, cleaning, sorting, dreaming. The work was hard, physically demanding in a way my desk job wasn't. But it was grounding. The fatigue in my muscles felt earned, unlike the weary exhaustion of constantly trying to measure up. The air in the house felt lighter after the wedding was over, a temporary lull before the next storm. That storm gathered around the subject of the honeymoon. Mark and Sarah had decided on a 2-week all-inclusive trip to Bora Bora. Lavish didn't even begin to cover it. I heard Mom and Dad discussing the costs in hushed, stressed tones. Then the hints started. Casual comments at Sunday dinner about how expensive luxury travel was these days. Pointed remarks about how Mark deserved this after all the stress of the wedding. The conversation drifted, inevitably, towards my contribution to the wedding. David was such a help. Mom would say, her tone implying that, naturally, I would continue to be helpful. It became clear, with chilling certainty, what was coming. They expected me to cover the Bora Bora tab. The confrontation happened at a seemingly innocuous family dinner a few weeks later. We were sitting around the polished mahogany table, the scent of Mom's famous roast chicken filling the air, the clinking of silverware providing a thin veneer of normalcy. Mark and Sarah were there, regaling us with tales of their wedding gifts. Dad made a joke about being all paid up after the wedding, then sighed theatrically. Mom seized the opening. Now that the wedding is taken care of, there's just the matter of the honeymoon, she said, her voice light but with an undercurrent of expectation. She looked directly at me. Since you were such a help with the wedding, David, we thought, well, you could just handle the honeymoon expenses too. It's only right. Mark deserves a proper trip after all this. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a question. It was a decree. My carefully constructed explanation about the junk store, my plans for independence, felt suddenly fragile, insignificant against the weight of their long-standing expectations. My palms started to sweat, a cold, clammy feeling. My heart hammered against my ribs. Saying no felt like stepping off a cliff. But looking at their expectant faces, at Mark's entitled smirk, I knew I couldn't do it. Not this time. Not with the key to the junk store, my dusty, hopeful future, burning a hole in my pocket. My voice was shaky at first. Mom, Dad, I can't. I used the rest of my savings to buy that old store on Elm Street. I'm gonna fix it up, open a junk and antique shop. The polite chatter died instantly. The clinking of silverware stopped. The room fell silent, save for the frantic pounding in my own ears. Their smiles froze, then melted into expressions of utter disbelief and, quickly, anger. You did what? Mom's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. A junk store? David, are you serious? Dad frowned, his disappointment palpable. What kind of foolish investment is that? We're talking about your brother's honeymoon, his future. You're wasting your money on trash. It's not trash, I tried to explain, my voice gaining a little strength as anger started to push past the fear. It's an opportunity, a chance to build something of my own. Build what? A collection of other people's garbage? Mom sneered, her face twisting with contempt. Her eyes, usually warm when she looked at Mark, were like chips of ice fixed on me. We told you Mark needed this money. He needs this trip. This is selfish, David. Incredibly selfish. After everything we've done for you. Everything you've done? The words spilled out before I could stop them. Years of quiet resentment bubbling to the surface. I've been helping out for years. Paying for things, fixing things, always being the backup plan. And the one time I try to do something for myself, something that isn't about fixing a problem for Mark or paying for something for you, you call it selfish. Oh, that little bit you helped with? Mom waved a dismissive hand. That was nothing compared to what we did for you. Raising you, feeding you, putting a roof over your head. And this is how you repay us? By prioritizing some dusty old building over your own brother. Mark snorted from his end of the table. Yeah, typical David. Always thinking about himself. Can't even help Mark out with his honeymoon. Cheap. His words, and my parents' cold, hard gazes, landed like physical blows. My chest tightened as if someone had wrapped barbed wire around my lungs. The air was sucked out of the room, replaced by a heavy, suffocating pressure. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about control. It was about their narrative of me, the unreliable, less valuable son who existed to serve the golden child. And then Mom delivered the final, crushing blow, her voice dripping with ice and disdain. You know what, David? If this is the kind of person you are, so selfish, so ungrateful, maybe you're not really part of this family after all. Wasting your life on useless trash like that store. You're just useless trash. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her eyes bored into mine, cold and hard. You're not my son anymore. Dad didn't say a word. He just sat there, eyes fixed on his plate. His silence a deafening affirmation of her judgment. Mark looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, not quite regret, maybe just discomfort. The words useless trash landed like physical blows, each syllable echoing the years of feeling less than. You're not my son anymore. It wasn't just a phrase. It felt like a severing, a violent tearing away of the very roots that were supposed to ground me. My vision blurred with unshed tears. The familiar smell of roast chicken suddenly made me nauseous. The house I'd grown up in suddenly felt foreign. Every family photo on the wall like an accusation. Fine? I whispered, my voice breaking on the single word. I stood up, pushing my chair back roughly. It scraped against the floor like a scream. I didn't look back at their faces, at their cold, unforgiving eyes. I just walked out of the dining room, through the silent, accusing house, and out the front door. The drive home was a blur. The streetlights blurred through my tears, each one a painful reminder of a home I thought I had, but didn't. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. When I got back to my small apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the edge of my bed in the darkness, the echoes of their words bouncing off the walls. Useless trash. Not my son anymore. The weight of their rejection was crushing, heavier than any physical burden. I felt utterly defeated, hollowed out. Every past sacrifice, every moment of hoping for their approval, felt like a cruel cosmic joke. I sat there for hours, shivering in the silence, feeling colder and lonelier than I ever had before. This was my rock bottom. The next few days were a haze of pain and disbelief. I went through the motions of work, but my mind was a constant loop of that dinner table scene. Mom's cutting words, Dad's silent betrayal. Shame washed over me in waves, followed by a deep, aching sadness. I felt like a failure, exactly what they had always seemed to believe I was. But slowly, insidiously, something else began to brew beneath the surface of my despair. Anger. Cold, hard, righteous anger. The injustice of it all. Years of quiet support, of trying to be the son they wanted, only to be discarded the moment I chose my own path, my own small dream. They hadn't just disapproved. They had tried to erase me, to deny our very connection, simply because I wouldn't fund their golden child's vacation. It wasn't about the $2,900. It was about control, about their inability to see me as a separate person with my own aspirations. I started going to the junk store again, not just to work, but to channel the raw energy of my fury. I attacked the grime with a new intensity, scrubbing years of dirt from the floorboards, tearing down sagging shelves. Each swing of the hammer against a rotting piece of wood felt like a blow against their judgment. The dust I stirred up felt like the settling residue of their toxic expectations. The key to the store, once a symbol of hesitant hope, was now a heavy, solid defiance in my pocket. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I called Sarah, my friend since college, one of the few people outside the family who knew the real me. It was hard to talk about, shame making the words catch in my throat. But I told her everything: the wedding contribution, the store, the dinner, Mom's brutal words. She listened patiently, her silence punctuated only by soft sounds of sympathy. "David," she said finally, her voice firm and kind, "that's not family. That's cruelty. What they did. You didn't deserve that. You are not useless trash. You are building something real, something yours." Her validation was a lifeline, a reminder that their warped view of me wasn't the only truth. She urged me to talk to someone, maybe a lawyer, just to understand my options, especially if there were any old family matters or assets that might be complicated by their declaration. Taking Sarah's advice felt like another step into the unknown, but necessary. I found a local lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Evans, who specialized in family law, but also dealt with small business matters. Explaining the situation felt surreal. My parents disowned me because I bought a $2,900 junk store instead of funding my brother's Bora Bora trip. Ms. Evans listened calmly, her expression unreadable. She asked about family assets, any potential inheritance, past financial arrangements. It felt invasive, but she explained she needed the full picture to advise me properly. She also mentioned that sometimes, when people react with such extreme anger to a seemingly minor financial refusal, it can be a sign of underlying issues. She was right. The parents didn't just stop at disowning me. They started a smear campaign. My phone, which used to be mostly silent when it came to family, suddenly buzzed with awkward texts and calls. A cousin asking if it was true I'd abandoned my family in their time of need. An aunt expressing concern for my mental state, repeating phrases that sounded suspiciously like Mom's pronouncements. They were painting a picture of me as the villain, the selfish, ungrateful son who had turned his back on his loving family. Mark likely helped, enjoying the drama, basking in the renewed parental sympathy directed his way. Seeing vague, pointed posts on social media from family members was like receiving tiny, digital stings, each one reinforcing my isolation. Every notification felt like a knot tightening in my stomach, the digital equivalent of their slamming door. Working on the store became my sanctuary. I learned to strip paint, repair furniture, research the history of the odd items I found. The physical work was therapy. The dust, the smell of varnish, the feel of smooth, old wood beneath my fingers. These were real, tangible things, unlike the shifting, unreliable sands of family approval. One rainy afternoon, while clearing out the cluttered back office, a room piled high with forgotten papers, old invoices and ledgers from the previous owner, a Mrs. Gable, I found a heavy, metal box tucked away under a stack of newspapers from the 80s. It wasn't locked. Inside, amidst Mrs. Gable's business records, were some older documents that seemed out of place. They weren't hers. They were family papers, my family's papers. My hands trembled as I pulled them out. Old deeds, bank statements, a will draft, and a thick file labeled Elm Street property. It was a file related to the junk store building. Flipping through it, my blood ran cold. These documents revealed that my parents, years ago, had owned a significant share in this very property with Mrs. Gable, potentially intended as an investment for their children. More shocking were the bank records showing a large sum of money, designated for future family investment, being systematically siphoned off over several years. Coinciding with the time Mark was in an expensive private school and later, starting his first business venture that Dad had heavily funded. The file also contained a draft agreement where my name was listed as a future co-owner of the Elm Street property, a plan that was clearly abandoned when the money disappeared. The paper felt thin, fragile, but the truth it held hit me with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't just about the honeymoon, it was about everything. Their long-standing financial stress, the way they relied on me, their intense focus on Mark's financial needs, their absolute contempt for this specific property. When I bought it, it all clicked into place with sickening clarity. They weren't just manipulative. They were actively deceitful, having diverted funds that could have provided me with a foundation years ago, all while fostering my dependence and Mark's entitlement. This wasn't just disowning. It was the endpoint of a long-term pattern of exploitation and betrayal. I took the box and its contents straight to Ms. Evans. She went through the documents methodically, her expression becoming grimmer with each page. "Mr. Peterson," she said, using my last name formally, "this changes things significantly. This isn't just a family dispute over a honeymoon. This suggests a potential case for financial misappropriation and breach of fiduciary duty, depending on the specifics of that old will draft and how those funds were handled." The evidence was undeniable. It confirmed their deceit, explained their desperation for money, and validated every suppressed feeling of being unfairly treated throughout my life. It also gave me leverage. Real leverage. We discussed the options. A lawsuit was possible but messy and potentially years long. Exposing them publicly was another option, but Ms. Evans advised caution, focusing on what I wanted as an outcome. I didn't necessarily want their money, but I wanted validation. I wanted them to face the truth, not just privately, but in a way that dismantled their careful social mask. The justice moment needed to be strategic, impactful, and undeniable. We decided on a formal mediation session, framed as a final attempt to resolve family differences, but orchestrated by Ms. Evans. We invited my parents and Mark. It was held in a neutral conference room, sterile, quiet, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos it contained. The tension in the air was palpable. My parents arrived, composed and radiating an air of injured dignity, clearly expecting to reiterate their narrative of my ingratitude. Mark sat beside them, looking bored and slightly annoyed to be there. I sat opposite them, Ms. Evans at my side. I wasn't the hurt, discarded boy anymore. The anger had settled into a cold, hard resolve. I was nervous, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, but I felt a core of steel I hadn't known I possessed. Ms. Evans started by laying out the basics, their declaration of disowning me, the reason they gave. Then she turned to me. "David, you have something you'd like to share regarding the context of these events?" I took a deep breath. My voice was steady, calm. I didn't raise it. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the facts, referencing the documents I had found, the ones laid out on the table. I talked about the Elm Street property, the funds set aside, how they vanished, connecting it directly to their expenses for Mark and their subsequent need for money, including the honeymoon. I spoke about the years of smaller contributions, the pattern of expecting me to foot bills while dismissing my own needs and efforts. I ended by stating that their reaction to my buying the junk store wasn't just about the $2,900. It was about control and the exposure of their long-standing pattern of manipulation and exploitation. The parents' faces, usually so controlled, contorted with a mix of fear and fury as I spoke. Mom interrupted repeatedly, sputtering denials, calling the documents fake, trying to gaslight me right there in front of Ms. Evans. "Lies. All lies. You're making this up. David, you're crazy." Her perfect facade cracked, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. Dad, for the first time, seemed truly shaken, his eyes darting between me, the documents, and Mom. He mumbled something about misunderstandings. Mark, who had been looking smug, went pale when I mentioned his expenses coinciding with the missing funds. He shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "I didn't know about any of that." Ms. Evans calmly countered their denials, referencing legal definitions and the clear paper trail. She didn't need to be aggressive. The truth, presented factually, was devastating enough. The power dynamic in the room shifted completely. I wasn't the useless trash they had disowned. I was the one holding the undeniable truth, the one who had built something real, while they were busy maintaining a facade based on deceit. The feeling of power returning to me as I spoke my truth was exhilarating, a quiet strength that resonated deep within my bones. The mediation ended abruptly, with Mom declaring it a farce and storming out, Dad trailing behind her, defeated. Mark mumbled another weak denial before following. The immediate aftermath wasn't a Hollywood ending. There wasn't a tearful reconciliation or a grand apology. That wasn't who they were. But there were consequences. Ms. Evans initiated legal proceedings based on the financial evidence, aiming to recoup some of the misappropriated funds and clarify ownership regarding potential family assets. This process was stressful, involving paperwork and court dates, but it was a necessary step in formalizing the boundaries. More immediately impactful were the social consequences. Word, perhaps through controlled leaks from Ms. Evans' office or through inevitable gossip channels once the legal action started, got out about the financial situation and the mediation session. The perfect family facade crumbled. The same relatives who had called expressing concern now offered hesitant apologies or fell silent. My parents' usual social circles became awkward. Their attempts to paint me as the villain rang hollow against the backdrop of their own exposed deceit. I also established clear, unwavering boundaries. I told them, through Ms. Evans, that any future contact must be through my lawyer. I would not be discussing anything financial, personal, or related to the past with them directly. The relationship was irrevocably changed, perhaps severed permanently in the traditional sense. It was painful mourning the idea of the family I wished I'd had, but it was also liberating. The peace that came with setting that boundary, with refusing to engage in their toxic dance, was profound. The word no felt foreign yet liberating. A key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was there. Meanwhile, my focus shifted entirely to the junk store. I threw myself into the work. I learned plumbing, basic electrical wiring, how to haggle for interesting finds at auctions. The physical transformation of the building mirrored my own internal healing. The dusty, neglected space began to breathe. I filled it with items that had their own stories, old books, antique furniture, quirky collectibles. People started coming in, drawn by curiosity, staying for the atmosphere. I wasn't just building a business. I was building a community. My friend Sarah helped out on weekends. Neighbors stopped by just to chat. I met other small business owners in the area, finding camaraderie and support I'd never had in my own family. We shared tips, frustrations, and small triumphs. This was my new family, a chosen one, based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine connection. The scent of polished wood and old books was my new perfume, far better than the faint, stale smell of their disapproval. Dusting off an old lamp, I felt like I was dusting off parts of myself, revealing something valuable underneath the neglect. The chime above the door wasn't just announcing a customer. It was a tiny bell of affirmation for the life I was building. The legal case progressed. It wasn't a total victory in terms of recouping every lost penny. Proving the intent behind decades-old financial maneuvers is complex. But it resulted in a settlement that acknowledged some level of past wrongdoing and secured my position regarding any future family assets, preventing them from disinheriting me purely out of spite. Crucially, it formalized the truth of their financial manipulation. And then the irony arrived. A few months after the legal settlement, after the initial social fallout had quieted down, the calls started. Not to Ms. Evans, but hesitantly to my personal number, calls I initially screened before letting them go to voicemail. Then texts, emails, from Mom, from Dad. Their elaborate facade, it turned out, hadn't just been cracked. It had shattered, and the pieces were proving very expensive to put back together. The legal battle, even the settlement, had drained them. Mark, it seemed, hadn't learned any lessons from the financial revelations and had continued his entitled spending habits, possibly getting into trouble himself and turning to them for bailouts, further depleting their resources. The social isolation meant fewer people were willing to lend a hand or a sympathetic ear. Their carefully constructed world, built on appearances and manipulating others, was collapsing. The messages were pathetic. They didn't apologize for calling me useless trash or disowning me. They didn't acknowledge the financial deceit. Instead, they talked about how hard things were, how family should stick together, hinting broadly at their financial distress. They needed a little help. They needed my help. The son they had cast aside, the business they had scorned as trash, was, ironically, the only stable thing left in their eyes. Their names flashed on my screen, a notification I used to crave, now a source of weary irony. The text wasn't, "I'm sorry." It was, "We need your help." It's family. The same old hook, but it had lost its barb. I didn't respond directly. I forwarded the messages to Ms. Evans. They were still trying to pull me back into their toxic web, trying to leverage the defunct idea of family for their own gain. Sometimes, late at night, sitting in my quiet apartment above the now thriving junk store, I think about those messages. They call and they beg, and I don't answer. Is that cruel? To leave them to face the consequences of their own actions? To refuse to be their rescuer one more time? Or is that just finally choosing yourself? I look around my space, filled with salvaged treasures, surrounded by the quiet hum of the life I built from the ground up, the life they called trash. It's not perfect. It's hard work, and there are still challenges. But it's real, and it's mine, and that, I've learned, is worth more than any amount of money or any parent's conditional love. What does family truly mean? Is it blood that dismisses you, or the bonds you forge in the quiet corners of the world, built on respect and acceptance?